The text itself that Saturday morning was from the book of Genesis, was the story of Joseph and his brothers and dreams and, human trafficking, interesting stuff. People come up and down to bless and interact. The rabbis explain, sermonize. But for the most part, this hour-long ceremonial storytelling was dull. And I'm being kind. And I sat there and thought to myself, what's wrong with this picture, right? Saturday morning, you got the Jews are in the pews. I got prime time. And there's a ceremony where we're telling scripture and it's not engaging. And this very story of Joseph is being performed on the stage on Broadway as a musical right now on a Saturday matinee, and people are paying $100 to see it.
I'm Eran Jor, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them. Rabbi Amichai Lau-Lavie is an Israeli-born Jewish educator, writer, and performance artist. He's the creator of Storahtelling Incorporated and the founding spiritual leader of Shul in New York City, an artist-driven, everybody-friendly, God-optional, pop-up experimental community for sacred Jewish gatherings. Amichai is a member of the Global Justice Fellowship of the American Jewish World Service, a founding member of the Jewish Emergent network, serves on the Leadership Council of the New York Jewish Agenda, the Advisory Council of the International School for Peace, a refugee support project in Greece, a member of the Advisory Council for the Institute for Jewish Spirituality, and is a faculty member of the Reboot network. Through all his endeavors, he brings a creative, inclusive, and vital energy to Jewish practice and Jewish life. Today, we talk about how the Jewish concept of the set table served both as a happy early memory and as an organizing principle for his later work. How COVID-19 made rituals and online communities more important than ever. His Orthodox roots as the scion of an ancient and respected rabbinical dynasty, and his journey of self-discovery through theater, drag, and art. His creation of Storahtelling, a way to bring to life the ancient ritual of the reading of the Torah, and the Maven method he developed to spread the practice further. The emergence of Shul and the community around it, and the power of spiritual design and a well-designed practice in transforming our lives and our communities for the better. I've long believed that one of the most promising avenues to apply design skills and creativity to is in designing communities, social rituals, and spiritual practice that suits the modern world. And as such, there's no one I can think of that exemplifies this better than Rabbi Amichai Lau-Lavie. I think this conversation, which is full of wisdom and fun, is a great introduction to exactly the type of spiritual design we need to see more of. So let's jump right in with Rabbi Amichai Lau-Lavie. All right, I'm sitting here across the screen from Rabbi Amichai Lau-Lavie. Amichai, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Eran. Wonderful to be with you in the same virtual space.
Yeah. And the kind of mandatory question these days, because of COVID and everything that's happening, I wanted to know, you're back in New York now, but how did you experience COVID first personally, what was going on, and then in terms of your work, in terms of your congregation?
From where I'm sitting right now in my home in Harlem, I'm looking at this really big mulberry tree that has become very dear to me and possibly me to her. And so COVID really got me to be not just at home, but also in my body and present in my presence in a deep way, so that nature became very important. I'm very lucky to have a backyard. So both really being very attuned to the subtle changes of the seasons, doing gardening both within my house and outside, and nurturing and nourishing my sense of well-being and finding the practices that I already have so critical, and my discipline more necessary for my morning meditation and yoga. My version of prayer deepened in a deep way. And what I did as soon as social isolation quarantine began on March 15th, 2020, I started an online meditation practice for my community, which we call the Daily Soul Spa. So that just to get people connected to each other, to feel less isolated, to have the ability to breathe, to recycle some of the Jewish spiritual tools in a way that will make sense to a very wide array of people. So the Daily Soul Spa started off as a 30-minute meditation, poetry, prayer mode that ran for 120 days straight, that I ran every day at 3 p.m. So it was taking the same principles that we already have the tools to not freak out and translate them into the virtual. It was extremely grounding and helpful for me and for the many hundreds of people who joined us over those many days. And we now continue with the Daily Soul Spa. We took it down to 3 days a week about a year ago. Whatever, one loses track of time. So that was just one of the many ways in which sanity was preserved.
Yeah. And if I'm not mistaken, you're doing some online rituals and practices before as part of experimentation. Am I right about that?
Yes. Yeah. I've been intrigued by the accessibility of virtual learning and ritual and connection for many years now. And when COVID began, in some way, Shul, my community, we were already poised to just take it to the next level.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's very lucky. And I was interested to hear about the meditation aspect. So I took a seminar in Tel Aviv University with Tomer Persiko. I don't know if you know the name.
Sure, he's a dear friend.
Okay, great. So he did a seminar on Jewish meditation. There was actually a seminar about Jewish meditation with Buddhist meditation. So it was him and Keren Arbel. She taught the Buddhist side and he taught the Jewish side.
Fantastic.
And it was phenomenal. So do you approach it from a Jewish practice? Do you approach it from a whatever works angle? How did you incorporate that?
That's a great question. I will say, and Tomer, if you're listening, I have your book. I really started it.
With a new book. He has a new book now. Yeah, just today I heard that he put a new book out. Yeah.
He's amazing. He's very prolific. Look, I'll say two things about it. First of all, my approach in general to all the ways in which I embody and embed Jewish practices in my life, the bottom line is not Jewish. The bottom line is human. Yeah. Jewish is a tool in the service of humanity. That is the same, in my opinion, for all religions and all paths. The tap is there to bring us water. It's not about the tap. So whether that is Shabbat or whether that is Yom Kippur, whether that is a morning meditation or how we sit Shiva for a loved one, these are tools that we are very fortunate to have inherited, having been perfected for thousands of years by practitioners of the spirit who found ways, as we keep finding ways, to be closer to ourselves and to each other and to whatever mystery is. So for me, the bottom line is not to do something Jewish for the sake of doing something Jewish and perpetuating or preserving Jewish. I'm doing it because there's some good stuff here. There's some good intel. There's some good tools. There's some good technologies. There's some good and meaningful mythologies that I feel connected to because in this lifetime, this is the mother tongue that I was born into. Meditation, and Tomer is a much better teacher of that than I, is a tool that is used in every culture to have us be more present, more focused, more helpful to ourselves and to each other. I've found over the years my path into the meditative, contemplative path, not through the Jewish direction, through Vipassana, through Zen, and eventually found my way into an integration where through using some Jewish practices, some Jewish liturgy, connecting the path of meditation to the Jewish life cycle. And at the end of the day, breath is breath. And focus is focus. So the fusion or the hybrid is really where I find it most.
Yeah, interesting. Most of my meditation background comes from Buddhism, and even a very specific kind of Buddhism, which is the kind of Theravada Buddhist tradition. But then you encounter Zen and you encounter Tibetan practices that work. And for me, it's all about getting to know your mind and running experiments and seeing what works. And so I think we're ready now to start our journey, which we usually start with this biographical opener question, which is, what's something you've learned in childhood that still drives you today, that's still with you today?
What a wonderful question. This feels very tangential and trivial and very gay, and I'll own all of them. I grew up in an Orthodox home in Israel, a very religious and social home. And I would say one of the highlights of the week for sure was Shabbat. And the Shabbat table, sitting around the Sabbath table on Friday night and on Saturday for lunch, was not only the key social moment where people would come together, family, neighbors, friends, because during the week it's much more random, but the gastro-Judaic experience of food being a central element of socialization and theology, perhaps even spirituality in a deeper way, and the aesthetics of the table. My mother, who is of British origin, brought really good silver and the nice linens and the good plates. And my job as a child was to help with the flower arrangement and to help set the table. So I have this innate memory that I still enjoy today to host, to have a table that is a beautiful table with the people around the table that is curated, not just as far as the dishes, but also the conversation and the topics. And I think the notion of the table is such an important feature of my Jewish upbringing and my Jewish life, that at my home, the table is where we come together. And I'm looking outside my window right now at my outside round table in the garden, where first thing I did when I got back from Israel just a few days ago, I got back on Thursday morning, and by Friday evening, I hosted a dinner party.
Nice.
Because that's how you come back home.
Yeah.
So I will take this notion of the table setting, and I can be, of course, meta-philosophical about it and say that the key text of Jewish law, for better and for worse, that is from the 16th century, is known as Shulchan Aruch, the set table.
Right.
Rabbi Yosef Karo, who wrote this book, which is really the A to Z of how to live your life Jewishly, used the metaphor of the set table, the sort of grounding principle of Jewish life.
That's interesting. So talk more about that idea of the set table, because I'm definitely not familiar with that enough. So I am familiar with, I guess the closest thing that I can come up to this is the Passover table, right? Where you have specific dishes served in a specific way, eaten in a specific order, with certain blessings, and also woven with the story of Passover. So is that a good metaphor? Is there more to it than that?
It's a perfect metaphor. I think what's so interesting, if you think about the Sabbath table and the Passover table, and I'll extend it or expand it beyond the Jewish context to, let's say, the Christian context, is that the evolution of the human experience of the sacred over the last 2,000 plus years includes a decentralization from a temple where there is an altar, and on the altar an animal is sacrificed or grains, and that is where God resides, and that's where the technicians of the sacred officiate, the priests, and that's where you come to eat. And that's where you come to be in the presence of the sacred. That's the Mizbeach, that's the altar that you read about extensively in the Bible, that was part of the pagan Semitic traditions of the Near East, that is very much central to many of the Mayan or the Aztec ways, that in many ways is what brings people together. Now, what happened in the Jewish historical and mythic landscape is that the temple ceased to exist. First, from a functional point of view, it just became a bureaucratic center of religious life that was not of resonance to many Jews, including young Jesus, who walks into the temple in Jerusalem and says, "What the hell is this?" and knocks over the tables of the money lenders and offers an alternative to that religious bureaucracy of proximity to the sacred. And later on, within several decades, the temple is destroyed by the Romans, and the religious leadership, the Jews, the early Christians, come up with an alternative. It isn't a singular altar in a singular place called Jerusalem. Every house of worship and every home contains an altar. And if it's in the church, then the altar is where communion happens, and the blood and the bread is consumption of the sacred. In the Jewish home, the table is where you sanctify the wine, where you cut the bread, where you come together as a community to have communion. So the evolution of religious practice from animal sacrifice to whatever, brisket, to sharing bread in a ritual sense is a very important evolution.
Yeah.
And the design principles that make a Passover table or an Easter feast, a Muslim iftar, a holy meal by any tradition, and again, I'll speak about the tradition I know, which is the Jewish, the table is the place where the sacred social contract is constantly renewed. And the rituals matter, right? It matters that you start off with the first course and you go to soup. And if you're Ashkenazi, there's gefilte fish. And if you're Sephardi, etc. It matters that these are the ritual foods. It matters that these are the plates that you take out every year for Passover. It matters that these are the songs. The wisdom of our ancestors to provide these blueprints for historical and mythic narratives that are grounded in the consumption of food is profound.
Yeah, that's just so much you unpack there, because it's a ritual. It's a well-designed ritual. It ties with our basic bodily needs and our basic sensations. It's communal, right? You don't usually set the table for yourself. You set it for a group of people, which is something that's very Jewish. And so it sounds, because you later, there's many things that you rebelled against, a young man. It sounds like there was before that a sense of really loving something that was part of that life. Is that a...
Yeah, 100%. I spent a great deal of time and energy rebelling against the Orthodox, Zionist, patriarchal, loving home I grew up with to find my own way. I came out as queer in my teens, realized that Jewish law as it is verbatim is a challenge, to say the least, and found other ways to question my values vis-a-vis those of the home and society I grew up with. And the process of not throwing the baby with the bathwater, but figuring out what matters and what kindles me and what I want to tweak and mix and match to be of relevance continues to evolve. My Shabbat is not exactly that of my Orthodox family in Israel, but so much is the same. And I just want to say something. You were talking about setting the table. One of the ways that I stayed both sane and amused during the first few months of COVID, I live alone in my home in Harlem. My children are elsewhere in Manhattan. My mother is in Israel. But I would set the table for myself every night with a napkin. And I was like, nope, we're not going to sit in front of the computer. I mean, maybe I'll sit in front of the computer. I'll put the Mac on the dining room table. But you're going to eat like a mensch.
Yeah.
And then Shabbat, I very quickly realized that a lot of people are home alone. And we can't eat together. We can't have Shabbat dinner together. So we created this thing called Shabbasics, which was basically a half-hour Friday night Zoom where we got people, wherever they were at home, light candles in front of the screens, raise a glass of wine, break some bread, share what's on their menu. And then those who wanted stayed on for another hour to just eat together across the screens so that the ritual of eating together on Shabbat is maintained.
Yeah.
Just for the sake of not being alone. And it was sad and stunning, and in many ways continues as COVID continues.
Yeah, we had COVID. The first Passover was under quarantine. Like
Oh,
you literally
yes.
couldn't get away more than 100 yards from your house. And very naturally, everybody moved to Zoom. Of course, we were going to still do it. It wasn't a question of not doing it. It was just a question of how to technologically see each other. And I guess I was, because I'm also a single man, then I had my parents together, my sister and her husband and their son together, and they all had more fancy meals than I did, but I had a bottle of wine, and we've shared the table this way. And I think millions of people did it, right? Like it's on Passover.
Millions.
Of course you're going to
Yes.
do that. Of course you're not going to give up being together.
Time will tell, and I'm sure sociologists are on it, as we are still in COVID in various phases. What will be the ramification of this acceleration of the virtual digital creeping into our erotic lives, into our ritual lives, into our every aspect of our lives, for better and for worse. And it's something that my team and I are extremely interested by. We're now planning the next season of the High Holy Days. We usually have 3,000 people in person. And for the last year was completely virtual. This year we're going for a hybrid. But we're trying to think, what does it look like moving forward? What is it going to look like for our children who are now teens and younger, who are digital natives, but also now scarred by this experience? So the design of our ritual life and social life, thinking into the future with a combination of virtual and in-person, I dare say this is going to be part of who we are for the rest of our lives.
Yeah, that seems reasonable. I wonder if you've seen this as this new Netflix special from Bo Burnham called Inside. And
No.
he's a young comedian who also a musician, and he was very successful before COVID. He started on YouTube, and then recently came out with this Netflix special describing his life locked inside, and he's deteriorating mental health and still finding humor about it. He has a song about FaceTiming with his mom, and a song about sexting, and a song about just like how this weird year that we've all had. And it's wonderful. It's so insightful. It's so funny. I think
I'll check it out. Thank you.
Captures this last year. But you had your own part of your self-discovery and part of leaving that house, and it's a very ancient rabbinical dynasty that you come from, and still to this day the chief rabbi of Israel today, right, is your first cousin, and you had an uncle that was a previous chief rabbi. And by the way, as I was researching this, I found out that Benny Lau is also related to you,
he's my brother.
Yeah, your brother, and someone I've been following for a long time with his 929 project, and at various points writing very sensible things in the name of Judaism on politics, and great voice, super important voice. And coming from those roots of both really strong Orthodox rabbis, and then discovering yourself through theater and through art and through drag. Tell me more about that. That's It sounds like this rush of experimentation, and as designers, we like experimentation. We like to emerge from something and try many different things. So, where is that a process of self-discovery? I would love to hear more about that.
Sure, it's absolutely a process. It's ongoing. I can say that a very pivotal moment in my memory that you will relate to because of our shared Israeli legacy and ancestry and relevance. In 1995, I was living in Jerusalem. I was involved in various education and cultural theater. I was interested in storytelling in some aspect and education. I was in my mid-20s. And there was a night where the Israeli Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin, was murdered, assassinated by a young Jewish man who came from a very similar background to mine, a religious Zionist Orthodox background, and he basically claimed his right to do what he did by God and by scripture, and to prevent Yitzhak Rabin from turning parts of the land of Israel to the Palestinians, and to defending Jewish future by murdering a fellow Jew, murdering a human being.
Yeah.
And I remember that night, I wrote a lot about it. And the following days that happened, Israel was in deep shock. And for me, what kept coming was the narrative, the legend, the story, the master story of the binding of Isaac from the book of Genesis, where Abraham hears a call in his head attributed to God to bind his beloved child and offer him as a sacrifice to God. And Abraham takes Yitzchak, Isaac, and binds him, and at the last minute replaces the kid with a lamb and hears a voice, and that human sacrifice is prevented. And Isaac is traumatized to this day, as are we, his descendants. But there's a moment of evolution, a paradigm shift. But when Yigal Amir killed Yitzhak Rabin, all that I could think of was like, and now the binding of Isaac was successful. This was the sequel. Here is a man quoting these scriptures that the land belongs to us, the children of Abraham, not to them, other children of Abraham, and that God or rabbis or whatever said to him, and he did it. He followed a divine commandment, and he came from a place of religious literacy, knowledge, and empowerment. He felt empowered in the name of the myth and the story to do what he did. And I remember thinking to myself, I come from the same background. I have similar privileges of knowing these scriptures and knowing these texts, but I'm taking them in a very different direction, which is humanitarian and liberal and progressive and peace-loving and not fundamentalistic. So it's my job, like that of other people, to combat Yigal Amir and his rabbis and comrades by taking Judaism to another place, equally legitimate.
Right.
And I understood that my job is not to so much deal with the laws, but with the stories, to be a better storyteller, to deeply examine what stories we are telling ourselves and how we are telling those stories so we can educate future generations, not to take the law into their own hands and to focus on these narrow-minded, fear-based, trauma-driven narratives of us versus them and either or, but find a deeper and higher and kinder way of both and coexistence and humanity serving us better. So that night for me was a kind of, I won't say a wake-up call, but it was a very strong drive to focus on storytelling. The metaphor that I used at the time was that if Judaism or Israeli Judaism is a car that's driving down the highway way too far a speed and about to crash, what you need to do is not change the color of the car. What you need to do is figure out what's the fuel and who's driving it. Yeah. And those are the stories that contain the values that we live by. So that for me was a decision to focus on the stories we are telling, how we tell them, that I want to be working with Jewish storytelling. That led me to theater, that mixed the weekly ceremony in every synagogue where we recite the Torah, this constant rerun of scriptures, and thinking, how do we do a better job of challenging this Bronze Age scripture with its social problems such as homophobia and annihilation of the other and misogyny and slavery and etc. How do we talk back to the text? So that led me to this theatrical exploration of site-specific theater that challenges the Jewish mythology. And eventually that led me to drag, because I, as somebody who was exploring my sexuality and my voice, found something very liberating in drag. I could do and be and say things with a wig and with high heels and with this altered persona that I, Amichai, felt discomfort saying. Yeah. And over time, that drag persona became scaffolding that was no longer necessary. Yeah. I was able to say the critical things I wanted to say in my voice. Yeah. And that led me eventually to taking on the rabbinate without losing the sense of the theatrical and storytelling is the core of the project here of reclamation and repair.
Yeah, no, there's a lot to unpack there, but I think many men can identify themselves with feeling very restricted in a certain masculine role and feeling liberated if you're in a situation like in Purim or where you can explore and be free of it. And yeah, no, I think it sounds like I would want to try that at some point. But from the context of going back to what you said about Rabin's murder and the Jewishness. So I had a professor in my master's, Ron Margolin. I don't know if you know him. Maybe he also studies. You know him. Okay. So he said, and he's in conversations with a lot of Jewish leaders from many different sects, many different types. He said specifically to the religious Zionists, you came from the older generation. You came from Western democracies, and you were also religious. And you found a way to balance both of these things, like the civil rights, the human rights, the democracy values with the Judaism. But when you educated your kids, you just took one side for granted. You just said, oh, of course, yeah, human rights. Oh, of course, democracy, the rights of the other, and certain things that are obvious. But you emphasize a certain kind of religion without giving that background, without emphasizing the democratic values, and as a result, you have a generation. I'm quoting him. I don't know how true this is, but where he claimed there is essentially a generation that had more moderate, more democratic parents, but they themselves, from morning till night, just studied pure scripture and religion and religious Zionist dogma without the rest of it, without the civil side, without the democracy side, the individual rights side. Does that resonate with you, or?
That does resonate. Look, we're in the middle of a very complex moment where there's, again, a paradigm shift in what is Zionist and what is religious. I do completely believe that we are in the middle of a process that will be known historically as post-patriarchy. After thousands of years in which the West, certainly the monotheistic traditions, have revered the divine as a godhead that is male, and revered males as the one to be holding the religious and political authority, it's been 100 years of challenging that assumption. 100 years is not a long time in human history.
Right.
So we're seeing it shift. We're seeing it shift as far as women's leadership and LGBTQ participation. We're seeing it shift in the theology that the big old man with a beard on the throne is not necessarily what people think about with the divine. We're seeing it in so many ways that we're just in the middle of. Now, that has impact on these patriarchal structures as far as hierarchy and as far as the dichotomies that we inherited. They include the political reality of Jewish people in the land of Israel who are back in the land after thousands of years, some of us with the old vision and some of us with other revisions. And what I think is a historical invitation of deep mythic proportions to do right by this binary either or patriarchal Abrahamic structure and come up with a new paradigm. Now that's hard. Change is hard. And PTSD, as we now all like to talk about, is a reality factor in Israel and in Palestine.
Sure.
We are the descendants of people who suffered the Nakba and suffered the Shoah, the Holocaust. My father was a Holocaust survivor. My mother lived through the Holocaust. I have friends in Ramallah and Gaza and East and West Jerusalem whose parents and grandparents went through horrific atrocities in the 1940s around the Nakba and after. It's still alive.
Yep.
So the response of religious Zionism to say, you don't matter and it's all about us because God says so in the Torah, okay, that's a legitimate response. It's grounded in history, but it's not helpful. Right? And it's the same for our fundamentalist friends in Islam. Well, we're seeing now in Israel that there are more younger people, thank goodness, who are saying, what's the practical way for us to live and not kill each other? And with all due respect to the scriptures we inherited, what can we do about reinterpreting them differently and finding the sweet spot in between? The religious Zionism I grew up with, that is now represented in the Knesset by Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is a racist thug.
Yeah.
I don't think we want to go down the rabbit hole of Israeli politics right now, right? I think there's a bigger question here. There's the bigger question about how do we, as human beings, honor the traditions we come from, understand where they serve us, understand where they fail us, and do the delicate work of redesigning them to fit our shifting realities. That is true for Americans right now who are dealing with the horrific legacy of indigenous annihilation and slavery and racism that is 100% part of being an American, no matter who you are as an American.
Yeah.
That process of reckoning, of repair, of reparation is critical for the sake of a healthy future in this country. Otherwise, we're just recycling that same trauma. And in some sectors in this country, that is clear, and that is being a commitment for a long-term process of repair. And in many other sectors, it is something that we're going to continue denying.
Right.
Because change is hard, and accountability and truth and reconciliation is hard. That is true all over the world. It is certainly true in Israel and Palestine, where 63 children were killed in Gaza and 2 children were killed in Israel in this latest skirmish, and Israel went back to business a day after.
Yeah.
But the moment Ben & Jerry's threatened to not sell ice cream in the West Bank, everybody's starting to talk about the occupation, right? There is a preference of people who suffer personal trauma or nations that go through generations-long trauma to not deal with it.
Yeah.
But the only way we will fix, and there will be a paradigm shift, is there will be repair. Is it happening in Germany? To an extent. Is it happening in South Africa? Somewhat. It's required on a deep level. So my hope is that maybe not for every Jew on the planet, but for more and more of us, taking the patriarchal legacy we inherited and customizing it to be egalitarian, liberal, queer-friendly, earth-friendly, radically relevant to who we are and who we are becoming is the order of the day. That's not everybody's cup of tea. And hopefully it won't be a bloody conflict between us. But there are ways in which we have to be honest with who we are. And that includes the understanding that there are people, that includes my cousins and nephews and close kin, who see things very differently than me.
Yeah.
To respect them in a pluralistic way is tough, but that really is the invitation.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems to be everywhere these days, where the easy thing is to attack and judge the other. And it's even easier when you feel moral superiority over them. And then the hard and necessary thing is to try to understand and try to find common ground.
Right, and engage. Yeah,
so,
super hard.
I hear you there. So I want to talk a little bit. I want to hear more about Storahtelling and Lab Shul, a little bit of history, and then I'm very interested in all the innovative practices that you came up with, that you design into this community, because I think that's where the designer in me really wakes up. So tell me how this practice started. I know you've had this. You told us about this realization that narrative is really key.
Yeah, sure. So if I go too long, just stop me, because this is something I'm very passionate about and I can go on for days. After this Rabin assassination, mid-90s, I was looking for my own path. And through a lot of ways, it brought me to New York, where I worked at a synagogue as an educator and as a teacher. And my portfolio was to engage Jewish adults in Jewish literacy through the arts and culture. And what I realized was that I had all these like really funky, awesome offerings and sessions and classes on sex and intimacy and rainmaking and like philosophy and Buber and bagels. And you got the usual suspects, and the majority of people did not get engaged with these forms of literacy. And my motto was like, if you're going to want to change, you need to know. In order to know, you need to learn. And then one Saturday I was at the synagogue and I participated / observed the religious service of Saturday morning. And central to that service is the ritual in which we take out the Torah scroll and we read out loud from the Torah.
Right.
Now, some of us who are familiar with Jewish life know it well. Most Jews who've had a bar bat mitzvah, rite of passage, participated in this ritual. It is conducted every Saturday in synagogues near you, and it's been going on for over 2,000 years. Now, that Saturday morning, something in me shifted. I watched a theatrical performance taking place in a sanctuary where there were a few hundred people, where for about an hour, a text was performed from a scroll, from a book, with a particular musical incantation. The text itself that Saturday morning was from the book of Genesis, was the story of Joseph and his brothers and dreams and human trafficking, interesting stuff. People come up and down to bless and interact. The rabbis explain, sermonize. But for the most part, this hour-long ceremonial storytelling was dull. And I'm being kind. And I sat there and thought to myself, what's wrong with this picture, right? Here I am on a Thursday evening teaching this story in a salon environment, and I get some seniors and some people who want a free cup of coffee showing up. But Saturday morning, you got the Jews are in the pews. I got prime time. And there's a ceremony where we're telling scripture and it's not engaging. And this very story of Joseph is being performed on the stage on Broadway as a musical right now on a Saturday matinee, and people are paying $100 to see it. So I went to the rabbis and I said, I want to change the paradigm here. Give me Saturday morning main space to reimagine how we tell Torah, how we talk Torah, how we take our scriptures and make them into something relevant, political, emotional, psychological, meaningful, engaging, fun. They said you can't, because Saturday morning is when we usually have our bar bat mitzvahs and it's a whole ordeal and the families come and you can't. But here's a Saturday morning in April where you can take over the Saturday morning service with a Torah service. It's the middle of the Leviticus. It's all about leprosy. Nobody wants it. Go for it. I went researching what is the anthropological history of the Torah service, of this ritual that is conducted in every synagogue, where every week throughout the course of a year, there is the repeat of the 5 books of Moses. Right. And the brief highlight of what I discovered was that this is one of the oldest ceremonial offerings in the Jewish menu, that it's been going on and off for 2,500 years, that it is the core educational component of Jewish literacy, and that until 1,000 years ago, for about 1,500 years, every time the Torah was publicly proclaimed in public space, originally in the marketplace, only later in houses of worship, it was always done in split screen. You would have somebody chanting the Hebrew in beautiful musical notation, and alongside you have somebody translating live into the language of the time and place. You had live subtitles. And the subtitles, known as Targum or Tarjum, translation, really is an interpretation, because you can never translate literally. It is always a process of interpretation. The people who did the translation were known as Mevinim, those who make understanding happen. Later on, Meturgemanim, interpreters. And those people were the loudspeaker or the captions or the bridge between the scripture and current day. And it's a tradition that died out about 1,000 years ago for a bunch of socioeconomic, religious reasons. I'd never heard of them. And I was blown away. I'm like, oh, this is exactly what I want to do. I don't want to be a rabbi exactly. I'm not sure I'm an actor. Perfect. Let's be the translator. What happens if you take scripture and you bring it to the 21st century as a performance. And there's lots of translations printed in English and any other language. You can sit in a synagogue, listen to the Hebrew being chanted, watch it being chanted, and follow along with the English translation. But what if it's theater? What if you actually see the English being played out? What if it isn't a dry translation, but actually a first-person narrative that challenges the text? What if it becomes interactive? So my fuses were on it. And then that spring, I brought the chapters in Leviticus about leprosy to life by being the translator, doing a lot of research. And I talked about HIV. It wasn't about leprosy as a biblical disease of infection. It was about the modern day. This is 1999. HIV still is a thing. Talk about the fear of infection and the psychological aspect of being quarantined. And people came to me that Saturday morning after services and said, what the hell was that? I never heard Torah the same way. I never realized that it speaks to my personal human experience. I sat riveted and I never looked at the book once. What is this? So that very early experience at Congregation B'nai Jeshurun in the Upper West Side, who's pioneering wonderful rabbis, gave me the permission to keep on exploring this methodology. That was the very beginning of Storahtelling. And that gave me the idea that what we can do is bring back this profession, hijack synagogues. Later we said upgrade synagogues because 9/11, and train people to be these translators so that future generations are permitted to talk back to the text and to challenge the homophobic, to challenge the colonial, to challenge the racist, to challenge the misogynistic, and say, okay, here's the Torah, it's written, I'm not denying it, but I'm talking back to it. And this is the core of Jewish literacy. You have the Torah, the teaching is comprised of two aspects. The written Torah, Torah shebichtav, that's the PDF, that's what's in the scroll, and that's the canon. But then you have Torah sheba'al peh, the written Torah, the oral Torah. That's the Google Doc. And that keeps on updated every generation. And the translator is the mouth, literally, of Baal Peh. The mouth that talks back to the ancient text and updates, challenges, questions, wrestles. I created this Jewish ritual theater company called Storahtelling that summer in 99. It still goes on. We understood after about a decade of exploration that the best place to put this methodology of translation to practice is in the coming of age ceremony of what we call B mitzvah, because that's gender neutral, where young people of Jewish faith and those who love them come to perform this ritual. And it's alive in a much more common way around this ritual than the people who would go to a synagogue on a Saturday morning. That's a much smaller number. So from a bandwidth point of view, we are now in the process of investing much more extensive training of people who train young people to be mitzvahs, not to chant the Torah necessarily, because for most young Jews, that is not a skill they would use throughout their lives. They don't know Hebrew and they might not chant it in trope, but to be critical thinkers and to talk back to scripture and to understand the tension between our ancient inherited Judaism and who we're becoming. That's a tool they would use throughout life to become mavens. So Storahtelling is now, as we speak, in this like next phase of being adapted as a training institute and as a methodology that will hopefully mostly be help in engaging young people and old people in talking back to the text.
That's amazing, and you call that the Maven method.
Because in the book in the Bible, in the book of Nehemiah, you have the description of the very first Torah service in history. We know where it happens. We know when it happens, and it describes hamevinim et ha'am laTorah. This profession is being introduced for the first time, and you speak Hebrew, ata mevin ivrit, but most of our listeners and people on the planet don't. The title, the profession, is those who understand, those who make understanding happen. That is the word mevin. It later became Yiddish, maven, and nowadays, a few blocks away from my house, there's the Maven Cafe, and there is a fashion maven and bagel mavens, and maven is an American word, somebody who's a know-it-all. But really what it means is a translator who makes sure that the ancient is being adapted to modern need.
Amazing. And you actually train these mavens. I'm curious because this is where it gets systemically really interesting, where it's not just about having these experiences, but it's about training people to create more and more of these experiences. What do you teach them? What does it look like?
We are in the process of reevaluating and revising the training. We created a curriculum and we created a pedagogy. I started off by creating a 12-step manual for how to do Storahtelling. We called it Torah Rehab. And then we realized that 12-step is too much, so we sized it down to 5 steps. There are just 5 steps how to create a Storahtelling using the Maven method. We work with people who have some kind of qualification, sufficient Hebrew or Jewish background. We work with clergy, Jewish, Christian, other. And we've tried a lot of different trainings over the years, and we're sort of like honing in on what is the sweet spot of who would be the best person to be trained. But ideally, it's a week-long training that, again, might adapt. We're using some of the classical tools for how to do Torah translation that are found in Jewish literature. In the Talmud, there are about 19 different rules for how the Torah translator must conduct himself or herself. For instance, when you're standing publicly on stage and somebody's reading from the Torah scroll, the translator, the Mevin, may not look into the scroll. You've got to be oral, so it will never seem to the audience that what you're saying in English is in the Hebrew scroll. Right? That's a rule. You got to know it by heart. You can't slouch. You have to stand straight, because you are representing scripture. It's line by line. One line Hebrew, one line English. One line Hebrew, one line English. That has to do with some kind of both of the vocal ability for the Maven, but also our understanding of, oh, I get it. It's ping pong, ancient, spoken. So there's a lot of those rules. Plus, we've brought in modern stagecraft and improv, and sometimes it's rap, and sometimes people use video or they use music. But the idea is, how do we become the mouths of this tradition, and not just neutral transmitters, but actual thoughtful wrestlers with it? People have different styles. And again, like I said, right now it is primarily used to train those trainers of 13-year-olds. Now, we can talk about that for a long time, because at the age of 13, being a public speaker is not necessarily your best feature. And I, at 13, stuttered heavily. Right? For me, my bar mitzvah was a whole rite of passage, because I had to speak. So we're using it as a way not just to think about how do you relate to scripture and create your own script, but what does it look like for you to be a thoughtful speaker, to think of what you want to say and do it less, and have the ability to be a public presenter per different children's and adults' abilities. So it's about a lot of different things. Yeah.
It sounds delightful. I actually had a pretty good bar mitzvah teacher who took the time to explain the story to me. He was a Reform rabbi, and he took the time to explain to me the ideas behind it. And I remember, as a completely secular kid, I've come from a very secular family, never took religion very seriously. But during that process, I did. And that is the only real connection that I've ever had with Judaism, but beyond being forced to study it at school in a pretty uninteresting way.
Can you hear me well?
So sounds like
something
has a lot of
shifted in my
potential
mind.
to do good.
I'm delighted to hear about your experience, Iran. It is maybe not completely unusual. You lucked out. I will say that one of my plans for the next few years, which is why I was so excited when you invited me to think about design in this context of ritual life, is to really take this to the next level, including Israel, where to invite Israelis to translate Torah from Jewish into Israeli, from ancient Hebrew into modern Hebrew, is an audacious invitation and a political one, and one that I'm finding out more is very needed. There's a lot of request for making Judaism meaningful in a modern, liberal, progressive way, and getting young people engaged with this way that empowers. So hopefully in the next few years, this training institute will be reestablished as a bigger offering, both here in the States and in Israel.
That's very cool. So I want to dive into a little bit of the more of the design aspects. But before that, maybe introduce us to Lab Shul. What is Lab Shul?
Sure.
And how does storytelling connect with it? What's the connection?
Totally. So that's a very fun story. So Storahtelling is a theater company, was founded in 1999. I was young, I was ambitious, I knew nothing about fundraising or managing anything. It quickly became this artistic collective of people who wanted to do it, and we started doing storytelling. We took the Torah to task. We traveled all over the United States. I was the artistic director. And what happened alongside was that a community formed, a community that started gathering for Shabbat dinners or invented our own version of Yom Kippur. And we were a collective of queer and Jewish and not necessarily Jewish and not everybody, just like a really great group. And over the course of close to a decade, this collective attracted a community and an audience. And we were doing theater and creating storytelling and educating and training, but also we're crafting our own ritual space. And by the time we had our own Yom Kippur in like 2006 or something, and there were 1,000 people there. And the methodology we used for translating Torah and challenging the grid were the ones we used for translating and challenging prayer. And thinking of how do we not just translate the Hebrew prayers into whatever English, but how do we question what's there and how do we make this work for people who might be agnostic or people who are not Jewish or for those of us in interfaith relationships? And how do we design the religious ritual into an interactive, theatrical, engaging experience that is like nothing any of us have been to before, but that excites us. So we were experimenting. And then there are different versions of the chronology there. But at some point around 2007, 2008, we realized that we are evolving from a theater company that has like a side industry of creating ritual and ritual space to actually a ritual congregation that is grounded in theater. And we took a year to focus group and brainstorm and be in a lot of different conversations. And out of that came the realization that we're going to morph and we're going to become a congregation. And Lab Shul was my suggestion. I was reading John Dewey at the time and really interested in educational reform. So lab is the lab and shul is like the Yiddish word for like a one-room schoolhouse where everything happens. So we went with Lab Shul as just like a placeholder while we were brainstorming and it stuck. And I also decided, I was nearing 40 at the time, that in order for me to be the leader of this community and to be really a change agent from within, that I will, to everybody's surprise, take on the rabbinate and actually go to school and be ordained as a rabbi. So I took the next few years at the Jewish Theological Seminary here in New York City to become ordained as a conservative rabbi while we were trying out. And those were crazy years. But by 2016, I was ordained. And Lab Shul is now in its tween years. And we are still experimenting what it's like to be a lab with the storytelling methodology at the heart of what we do. Whether we translate scripture, prayer, whether we adapt weddings, funerals, life cycle moments, and even COVID, really thinking how do we translate what we've known into helpful and applicable offerings that make people's lives better.
Yeah. Incredible. I like the lab. It's experimental and it ties very beautifully into the design sensibility that I'm trying to connect this with. But before we go there, I wanted to say I love your tagline, which is everybody friendly, artist driven, God optional, all ages. How could it be more perfect, more open, more exciting?
No, we're working on more. We're working our way through a multi-year, very invested process of being worthy of the title anti-racist. And we have pop-up in our tagline as well. COVID made that irrelevant. We don't have a building. That was by design. And each one of those titles really was very thoughtfully crafted. I will say that God optional that I came up with is something that we're thinking of how to rename. Because what it really means is you can believe in God, you don't believe in God, whatever you believe in God, as love, as life, as essence, as mystery, as your higher self, as nature, that's fine. It's metaphor, and we don't want to be stuck to that same old notion of a hierarchy, of a transcendental judging God. But a lot of people misjudge or misinterpret what this God optional means. So at some point we might rewrite it. But in the lab sense of who we are, it's constantly about exploring what we inherited and how it keeps shifting.
Yeah. So I love this. So I don't know if you have any direct relation to or direct connection to design thinking or design as a theory, as a practice. So I'll introduce design thinking. So design thinking is this theory that was popularized in the Stanford Design School, which is now changing many institutions around the world, from big businesses to governments. And it breaks down the design process into 5 stages. So it starts with empathy, empathize with a problem, a challenge. Then define the problem, define what you're trying to solve. Then ideate, which is essentially a process of divergence, many divergent ideas, and then eventually convergence into a few solutions that actually are worth trying. Then prototype, which means try. This is the lab. This is why I connect with the lab. Build something to try out, and then test is the final stage. And that's and then keep empathizing, defining, ideating, prototyping, testing until you have a solution that's stable. Though I guess stability is not necessarily the goal. So I guess the first question is: do you recognize these stages in your own process, in your own journey?
Look, what's crazy, I'm immediately trying to see whether this works with a 5-step Maven method, which is how we work with every story to craft a new storytelling experience out of it. It's a stretch. I can work on it.
Yeah.
But I love this. I'm, as far as design, from the very, very get-go of my work, even before Storahtelling, the visual design, the marketing, the packaging, the aesthetics is so important to me. I'm notorious in the Storahtelling Lab Shul universe for being an impossible and irate sort of
consumer of design. Yeah.
No, I'm basically like everything we do, I need to work with the graphic designers. And I'm like, no, I want this and thing. And what can I say? I'm pretty good at it. And I'm
comes from that table. Comes from that table.
I think aesthetics matter, but it's not just about the aesthetics, it's about seduction. So many people are so triggered, exhausted, allergic to religious life, to Judaism, to old school. So there's something about giving it a fresh, surprising, seductive approach that actually, oh, wow, you can do that. Okay. Yeah. So the empathy is where, let's say, we're looking at whatever, Shabbat, Passover, Yom Kippur, and saying, okay, here's what this is about. It's important. It's meaningful. It's here to give us, let's define what the issue here. It's beautiful, but it doesn't work. So what are we going to do in making Yom Kippur applicable to young Jews and those who love them, for whom Hebrew doesn't necessarily resonate? God is not a thing. Repentance is repugnant, but the search for exploration and reflection and community and being moved is what we want. So then we're going to ideate, and we're going to try a whole bunch of different ways of taking that old product and tweaking it. And then the prototype, I'll say, so here we are, X years into trying our version of Yom Kippur, and we've been testing it. Some of it works, some of it doesn't. We're right now in the process of planning Yom Kippur 2021 as a hybrid model of in-person and online, with some of the Ashkenazi traditions and Sephardic traditions, with leaders from different traditions, with the levels of interactivity that we're keep pushing. And I would say in some way, that is exactly how we're working. And I would love for it to be more professionally thought of, certainly as we're thinking of the Storahtelling next iteration. sounds like I need to work with you or with somebody on like very, very coherent design thinking as we strategically plan the next phase.
Yeah. What I find is many people that I talk to that are making new things, new original things, naturally follow this kind of path because there is no other way. And so the way that people who write about design thinking and define it, the way they define it is it's different from engineering thinking. It's different from scientific thinking. Engineering thinking is you know where you want to go and you just have to figure out how to get there in its very, and you know the subject matter, you know the rules of the medium, and you're just constructing something that works. And here we don't know where we're going. We know there's a problem and we need to build our way towards a solution. And I love it and I see it everywhere now, like a hammer that sees every problem as a nail. But I'll make this additional connection. So I don't know if Alain de Botton's book about religion for atheists.
The School of Life is a favorite.
Yeah. So I have a signed copy. I went to see him live and I love this book. And the book basically started me on the path to my degree, which is in religious studies. And he talks about having secularized badly, right? Having gaps in secular life where we don't really have good ways of dealing with birth, death, love and marriage, loneliness, old age, dealing with trauma on a communal level. And so I want to hear your designer take at these problems. Do you see them as gaps that you're trying to fill, or do you come at it more from a more of a specific practice that you're trying to workshop and make better? How do you think about the touch points with people's lives?
So this goes back to something we said earlier, that for me, the bottom line of ritual or practice is not the preservation of Jewish, but the engagement with human. So, for instance, a friend of mine lost his father last week. Complicated story, complicated family, Jewish, not Jewish, elder, complicated. They wanted a shiva. They wanted the Jewish ceremony where you come together at home and mourn. But it was pretty clear that this should not be, or this would not benefit from having the usual building blocks of a shiva that might include an evening service in whatever version of contemplative worship. Yes, maybe a mourner's kaddish, but this is not going to be a traditional shiva. And so the understanding was that what this family needed, what this person needed, was not the particular traditional context, but a framework within which to mourn, to bring family and friends into the sphere, to not be alone, and to honor his father's memory in some way. So partially on the phone with him and partially on the spot in the living room, we crafted a 1-hour ritual in the context of a 3-hour gathering where obviously food was important and just socialization. But there was like a 1-hour ritual where it was using the traditional Jewish tools of Shiva, but tweaking and adjusting them to work for this particular family. It had to have a beginning, middle, end. There had to be a way of being in the liminal. There had to be a way of like silencing the chatter and bringing ourselves into presence. This is not a room of people who know each other, nor is meditation a given, but there's a way you can get people to be quiet. There's a way for letting him be present and vulnerable and fragile. There's a way to invite other people to share stories about the dead man without overtaking the room. And there's like this navigation and facilitation with some poetry. And at the very end, we had handouts of the mourner's prayer, the Kaddish, with our English translation that is very user-friendly and everybody-friendly and all that. And people were invited to just come and say it together. It was a 1-hour, very moving, meaningful ceremony that used the elements that we're familiar with, but tweaked them to suit the situation as opposed to be a cookie cutter.
Yeah.
So I'm using that just as an example because this is really what drives me and my team and many others to consider every opportunity of a life cycle moment as an opportunity for growth and for meaning making. When I start a ceremony such as I did with this particular case in this home, I said, look, Ask yourselves, there's 60 people in this room, why are we here? My response, yours might be different, is we're here for 3 reasons. Number one, we're here to honor the memory and the legacy of a human being who is now deceased. Now, maybe that helps the soul go up to heaven. I don't have data on that. Maybe it just honors the fact that this footprint has been left here for us to honor. Okay. Second, we're here to support the mourners, his son and widow, his grandchildren, whatever. We're here to support the mourners by letting them emote and not be alone and share their feelings and be held. And third, we're here to deal with our own anxiety around mortality. We're here to come together as human beings, honoring life and honoring death and taking the time in the middle of our day, middle of our lives, to come together as humans and do what humans do in every tradition, in every culture. Celebrate life. Learn from the deceased what we can do to learn life better and be there for each other. Now, there might be other reasons why you're here today, right? The deceased was your boss and you have to show up. Or there's free food. Those are all legitimate reasons. But once you frame it, oh, right, that's why I'm here.
Yeah.
I'm having a human experience and it's beyond my ego.
Yeah.
It's not just utilitarian or practical. So I find that all life cycle moments, such as the ones you mentioned, once you frame them in this way, they're about perpetuating our sense of well-being, and they're allowing us to grow as people. And then, yes, I am at cousin Marty's bar mitzvah, and it's boring as thing, but that's why I'm here. Right?
Yeah.
And hopefully, if we do it, it's not boring, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really about the framing of the why, and it's the designing of the how.
Yeah. That makes me think of this book, The Art of Gathering, by
Priya Parker. Yes.
Yeah.
My dear friend. Yes. I'm in it, actually.
Oh, wonderful. I read it, but I guess I didn't make the connection. But it's all about how these gatherings work better when you have a purpose, when you know what the purpose is. Wonderful book. And so if we look at secular life, and I tend to, and I know you're in the same position, I tend to compare Israel and the U.S. a lot. And one reason I'm in Israel now and not in the U.S. after having lived in New York for 9 years is that the U.S. feels too, I don't want to say too individualistic, but too isolated. People are too separate from each other and uninvolved with each other's lives. And people feel that's right in a very deep sense. That the right thing for everybody to be concerned with is their own life and not much else. And this is comparatively. Everyone is different, of course. But in Israel, there's much, much more. A percentage of everyone's mindset is much more to the collective endeavor and the collective trouble and the collective everything. And as a result of that, the U.S. felt to me often like a lonely place because even though I had many friends, they were too self-involved to actually feel like a community. And so I wonder what you think about that, and then what would be your advice for finding a tribe, even in a place like New York, where it's filled with hyper-individualists chasing their own career? What are your thoughts about that?
First of all, I resonate very deeply as an Israeli who's been here for 20 years and just spent 7 weeks in Israel, and it's no secret to those who know me and work with me, my trajectory to return to Israel, if not full-time, then a lot of my time is it's happening. For all the reasons you've said, I also miss my mother tongue, Ivrit, and there's something in me that in my 50s now I'm planning forward. There's work I want to be doing there, and there's a part of my being that sings there in a deeper way. Resonates deeply. I agree with you about the notion of the rugged individualism of the American and the capitalistic notion of the consumer and the great deal of loneliness. I think COVID brought that to the forefront in tragic ways. The good news is that it's making us aware of what we need to do to craft and co-create these circles of meaning and community in whatever ways possible so that we gather and don't isolate. Between theory and practice, the gap is big, but there's an aspiration here. I think both in Israel and here and elsewhere, the invitation is for people to figure out what are these circles of care that one must invest in. Doesn't have to be religious, right? I was in Tel Aviv a few weeks ago on a Friday night, and I was on a rooftop with some friends, and we had a Friday night dinner, as I like to have. And I looked down from this like 7th floor thing in North Tel Aviv, and looked at all the balconies where people having, what's it called, arukhat shishi, right? Like Friday night meal. Now, it's not a Shabbat meal in the sense of a religious Sabbath observance, and it might or it might not include the ritual props from a glass of wine to a braided bread, but people come together. It's a thing. And so I think that kind of thing is an important thing. And whether that is reading clubs or whether that is knitting circles, whether it's people who are finding the ways to invest in each other's well-being, that tribal wisdom of small circles within a bigger circle is a must. I would say that for Lab Shul as a community, we realize that people coming together for spiritual contemplation, whether that's a Friday night or Yom Kippur, that's only a very small slice of what the communal responsibility is. People coming together because they're dealing with aging. People coming together because they're queer and they want to talk about that. People come together because they are the parents of Bar Mitzvah children. People are coming together because they're involved in social justice projects around refugees. People are coming together for any sorts of reasons. But these small circles within the larger circle is what creates intimacy and accountability and battles isolation. And I speak for myself, like I need those in my life. And I think what's interesting is that people like you and like me and other people we know serve a role in society as being the conveners. Like we take the rock and we throw it into the lake and then there is a ripple. And then it's our job to work with and delegate and co-create and empower other people to be the co-creators of these circles so that they go on and perpetuate themselves. So we're not the ones to always carry the, here I am hosting dinner again. That gets to be exhausting. That's a burnout. So there's wisdom here in weaving these responsibilities of leadership. Bialik, Israel's famed poet, came up with this idea of Oneg Shabbat way back in the 1920s or 1930s. It wasn't a religious thing. It was like a cultural get-together on Friday night to celebrate human values and culture and art and just come together, right? So it's things like that, these type of designing these moments and these opportunities for us to be together as humans and to support each other through whatever shared common denominator we have.
Right.
I think that's really the invitation.
That's amazing. That's good advice. And I think for me, I may be locked into this idea of I have to find the perfect community, the perfect tribe, instead of just going for let's join many different groups and see where I feel at home. I keep thinking I'm not a Zen Buddhist. I'm not a this, I'm not a that. I'm almost prejudging and searching for some sort of perfect situation. Whereas I have a friend who's a successful designer who just volunteers at the Magen David Adom, which is the Israeli Red Cross. And he has a built-in community and also the feeling of doing good in the world. And he feels more connected. He has his tribe.
Right. And I think what's happening now is that we have the invitation to, maybe for always, maybe for a while, to be in multiple tribes within ability. Capacity is an issue, but know that there are one size fit all is not gonna cut it. Like in some way, we are evolving as a species in some way. By the way, my time in Israel now, what I've noticed is that probably because of the extent of trauma and the spiritual thirst, because Judaism to a great extent is not nourishing people's thirst for spirit and for community, psychedelics and like medicine circles are profound And so many people are doing them. And that is literally a tribal response to human isolation.
Yeah.
And you're having these like circles growing and growing in the same way that around Vipassana and around through Zen and around through various Jewish spiritual practices and others, people are finding their small tribes where they can grow as individuals and also witness each other's being.
Interesting. So I have one final question for you, which is our standard closing question, where I actually quote from Alain de Botton. I cite his TED Talk where he talks about the difference between a lecture and a sermon. And he says a lecture is there to give you a little bit of information. That's the kind of secular version. And a sermon is there to change your life. And so I am going to tailor this to my audience. Well, let's assume that they are, by and large, completely secular, never found their way into any sort of religion, any sort of spiritual practice, might be open to it, but what is a sermon that you can give a person like that? One thing that could really change your life?
Go spend 10 minutes without your phone, sitting against a tree, sitting under a tree. Look at the tree, feel the tree, listen to the tree. The oldest image in our Semitic tradition of the divine is that of a tree. She was cut down by patriarchy, by men who sought to replace the God of here and now with the God of up there. And there is something about the tree that is our partner in oxygen and life that is the metaphor for so many of our growth paradigms. That is simply and silently inviting us to rediscover a very deep, immanent sense of being in the world. From our roots to our trunk, to our branches, to every single piece of our leaves dropping and growing again. I would say the invitation for reclaiming our divinity and our humanity can probably benefit from some time spent with a tree.
Thank you very much, Amichai. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and I hope we continue these conversations, and ideally in person, under a tree.
All right, that's it for today. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to support it, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast app or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We run design sprints all over the world, and our goal is to improve outcomes, whether in business or various organizations, through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone. See you next week on Remake.